Hi everyone, this is Medhat Elmasry again, and today I want to cover the topic of how do you extend and how do you seed users and roles using the ASP.NET Core 2.1 identity framework. And I will be using Visual Studio 2017 for this one. So let's get started. So I'm going to create a new project. So I'm going to use the ASP.NET Core web application template, and I shall call it Identity Core. This here. And I will use Web Application Model View Controller and ASP.NET Core 2.1. And I will need individual user authentication. So I'll turn this on, click on OK, and off I go. So let's run the application and see what we've got. Let me register a user. And notice here that when you register a user, it's asking you for your email address and password. Now, we want to extend this today. We want to capture more information. But let's just register here and say I want to register AAA at AAA.AAA, for example. And let's click on register. At this point, it's trying to create the database, and we need to click on apply migrations because there is a migration that is outstanding and we need to apply it. So click on apply migrations and then refresh the page. And it should work. And there it is, it works. And as you can see here, the user is logged in. So I'm going to log out. Now, to start with, let's assume I want to capture the following. First name, last name, street, city, province, and postal code. In the case of the United States, this would be state and zip code. So in order to do that, I need to extend the built-in identity user. So if you go into data application DB context, you'll see that this is inheriting from identity DB context. Now there are users in here. If you go to views, login partial, you will see here that it's using identity user for logging in. This is the class that's built in, it's baked into the identity framework. This is the class that only captures username, email, and password. These are only the three things that it captures. But it's baked in. We want to extend that. So what we need to do is come into the models folder and let's create a new class here. And I'm going to call it application user. Now this application user, I'll have it inherit from the identity user, from this class. And this needs to be resolved. It belongs to the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity assembly. Let us create a constructor. And this constructor, it simply refers to the base class. And then we're going to add some additional properties, the additional properties that we want to add to this particular class. So I'm going to create these additional properties. And I'll copy these and repurpose them for everything else that I want to do. So here I am with application user, which is really a specialization of the identity user class. Just as I did with the identity user, I want to also extend the role. With roles, let us say I want to add something like a description and a creation date of that role. So I'll do the same thing. I'll come here and add a new class. And I'll call that class the application role class. And this will extend the identity role class. And let's resolve this. And for this, once again, we're going to create a constructor that refers to the base class. And we need another constructor where you can pass the role name and it passes that role name to the base class. So this is the second constructor. And we will do a third constructor. This one takes two arguments, the role name and the description and the creation date. Okay, and with this constructor, we're also passing the role name to the base class. We're going to add here two local properties. This is the extension that we're trying to do to the identity role class. We're going to add one property, which is a description. And another property, which is a date time, and it's the creation date. Going back to this constructor, so we'll set the local description property to the description that's being passed by here as an argument, and the local creation date property, the local one that's being passed through. Okay, so now we have this class ready to go. We need to do a small change. We need to go to the application DB context. And looking at the application DB context, this extends identity context, but we want it to use the identity context based on the application user, the application role, and we're going to add a string here as the third generic. Let's resolve these. So we need to make this change to the application DB context, so it needs to know that it's going to act upon different classes. So we can close this. Now I want to create some dummy seed data for users and the roles based on our revised model. So I'm going to create here a class that I shall call dummy data. And I've got some code for that I'll just paste here, and we'll review it in a moment. So let me resolve all these namespaces here. And that's about it. So what am I doing? In here, there's a method called initialize. And this initialize method, it expects 3 arguments. It expects the context, a user manager object, and a role manager object. The first thing we'll do here is we want to ensure that the database is created. Here are 2 roles. The first one is the admin role with a description, because remember that we extended the identity role to include a description. And then this is role number 2, which is member, and a brief description. The password I'm going to use always is this password. The first thing we do is we check in the database, do we have role 1? In other words, do we have admin? And if we don't, we're going to instantiate a new admin role, and this is the constructor that we created. If you go to application role and look at this third constructor, it takes a name, a description, and a date. So if we go back here, this is the constructor I'm using. I'm instantiating a role with a name, a description, and time. And the role manager, it has an async method called createAsync. So we'll be also creating role 2 in a similar manner by passing the name, which in this case would be member, a description, and a date and time. The next thing we're going to do is create the users. So I'm going to check, do I have this user AA at AA.AA? If I don't, then I'm going to instantiate this application user. And remember, this is the class that I created today with all the properties. I'm going to create the user. After I instantiate the user, I'll call the user manager create async method to create the user. It returns a result. If the result is succeeded, it means that the user has been indeed created. After the user is created, I will add to the user a password. And I will add this user to a role. So I'm going to add this user to role, which is in this case admin. And both are being done using the user manager object. Now, the admin ID is going to be what's returned from the newly instantiated user object. And this admin ID, it will be a GUID. Because internally, when a user is created, the unique identifier for that user is a GUID. I do the same thing here for a second user, and a third user, and a fourth user, same thing. So this is my way of seeding users. Now we need to make a bit of a modification in the startup.cs file, right here. Because when you add the default identity, you're basing it on identity user. But we have a specialized version of this user object. So let's delete this and paste this code. Let's resolve this first. This says that we're going to create our identity based on application user and application role. In the options, the maximum length of the key is 128. And the store we're using is the application DB context. We're going to use the default UI and the default token providers. What's meant by the default UI is because the actual UI that's being used for registering a user and updating the password and all that, it's actually baked into the identity framework. And we're going to expose it later on. But at the moment, wherever you go here, you will not find the UI. For example, this tree structure here, it says areas, identity, pages. But where are the pages for registering a user? It's nowhere to be found. Because in the ASP.NET Core version 2.1, they baked the UI into the framework. But we can expose it later on, which we will do. The next thing we need to do is go into the view, this login partial, and this should not reference anymore identity user. It should reference application user because things have changed. Now, with the magic of dependency injection, we will pass the appropriate objects that need to be called when we call the dummy data initialize method. So in the dummy data initialize method, we need to pass the context, the user manager, and the role manager. And this we will call from within the startup configure method. So let's go to the startup configure method here. And if I call the dummy data dot initialize method, I need to pass it a context, a user manager, and a role manager object. Through the magic of dependency injection, I'll just have it injected into this method here. So I can come in and change this. So I'll call this the context. And I want to pass the role manager and the user manager. So now I can pass the appropriate arguments here. The first thing it wants is the context, so I can pass it the context. Next thing it wants is the user manager. Third thing is the role manager. I add to add wait because it's an asynchronous method. We will notice that if you go to migrations, there is this migration that created for us these tables that have to do with identity framework. And we already applied this migration. But now we've changed things. We have new properties that are associated with this table. So we need to add migrations. We can add migrations using the .NET utility. So let's go to a command line window in here and use the .NET utility to add these migrations. So we can go .NET EF migrations add, and we'll give it a name like extended users and roles. So the migration has been added, and if we go down back to Visual Studio, we will see here are the roles that were added. And it tells us that we need to add a column city to ASP.NET users, country, first name, all the stuff that we added. As additional properties, there's a migration for that. Next thing is let's update the database. So we can go back to this command line utility and go .NET EF database update. And this should create for us those additional columns in the database. And as you can see here, there are a bunch of alter table commands that are adding those columns to the database. Let's run our application now and see if it's working. We created an account called aa@aa.aa. Let's see if I can log in with that account, because if I can log in, then it's working. aa@aa.aa and the same password. Log in, and it's working. Let me log out and try another one. There was one mm@mm.mm. This means that our database was seeded. At what point was the seed data applied? The seed data was applied when I started my application, because the seed data is called from within the startup.cs configure method. Now, the next task we need to accomplish is, how do we add this to the UI? Let's log out and register. And when we look at the screen, it's insufficient, because we need to capture more than email password. We need to capture the first name, the last name, and all that stuff. But where is the UI for that? We discovered that there is no UI. How do we get that UI? Well, as I said before, the UI is baked into ASP.NET Core 2.1. I have to expose it. So let's go back into Visual Studio and come here and say add new scaffolded item. And you should choose this tab here, the identity tab. Click on identity, then add. You get this dialog. Now this dialog basically is telling you which ones do you want to expose, because in the identity framework there is a login view, there's the logout view, there are all kinds of pages and things like that. And the one that we're really interested in is this one, the register one, because we want to modify that. But for our purposes, let's just override all of them. Another thing that it asks you at the bottom is what context do you want? We just have only one context, so we're going to choose this one. That's an easy decision to make. Click on Add. So when that's done, you get like a scaffolding README. I'm going to close this and just show you what has been created. What has been created is a whole whack of files under account. If you go under areas, identity, pages, account, you see a ton of files here. And the one we're going to focus on is this one. And these are razor pages. These are not really model view controller pages, they're razor pages. And they have this concept of something of a code behind page. So this is the UI and this is the code behind. We're going to modify register.cshtml and register.cshtml.cs. If you open up register.cshtml, you will notice that this is the one that's capturing the email, the password, and the confirmed password. Let's go to the code behind, and you will see here under the input model, this you could say is the view model that's being used by the registration page. So we need to update this view model with those additional properties that we want to capture. So I have the code that we want to add to this class, and inside of this class input model, I'm going to paste the additional properties that we want to capture, and they are: we want to capture the first name, and the data type is text. This is required. This is the string length, and this is the display name. And the same is true of the first name, the last name, the street, the city, the province, the postal code, and the country. And there's another method that is of interest to us. It's the OnPost ASIC. And on the OnPost ASIC, when you instantiate a new application user, we're only adding these properties. But we've got more than that. We need to add more properties. So I'm going to comment this code out and replace it with some revised code. I'm going to replace it with this. So when we instantiate an application user, we want to grab all these additional properties. Notice that when you instantiate a user, there is username and there is email. ASP.NET Core assigns the same value to the username and email, but you can separate them. The username, for example, could be Joe, and the email could be joe@hotmail.com. They don't have to be the same thing. Next, we have to look at the UI, because the UI needs to change too. And the UI is this register.cshtml. I have some revised UI for this that I will replace in a second. We shall paste this revised UI right after the validation summary in this place. Now this UI is going to capture everything else that we need to capture. Let us test this out, see if it's going to work. So we're going to run our application. And let's register. You see, we get everything that we want to capture. So I'm going to enter this dummy data here. For email, I'll say joe@joe.joe. And let's register. And sure enough, we're able to register. And if we go to the database, we should be able to see that data. Let's find out. To go to the database, you need to go to View SQL Server Object Explorer. And here it is. Let's expand the databases. And our database is this one here. Let's expand this. The tables and the users and view data. And here we are. Here's my Joe. And if we continue on the right hand side, yeah, here's the additional data that has to do with Joe. So I'm going to highlight Joe here and go to the right side, and you can see that the data I entered has hit the database. So we have succeeded now in extending the identity framework users and roles. We succeeded in modifying the UI and capturing all the additional information that we need. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you on another occasion. Goodbye.